On the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West stands a fortress that shouldn't exist, the Dakota. German Renaissance grandeur rising from Manhattan bedrock. 9 stories of ornate brick and terracotta. Iron gates guard the entrance archway. 65 apartments behind walls, thick enough to silence the world outside. The most famous residential building in America. When construction began in 1880, newspapers called it Clark's Folly. The location was wilderness. No wealthy family would live that far north. The building would stand empty, proof that Singer sewing machine millions couldn't overcome geography. They were wrong. For 140 years, the Dakota has survived every threat and absorbed tragedy without surrender. This is the story of the apartment building that refused to fail. In 1879, Manhattan's fashionable district ended at 42nd Street. Beyond that line lay wilderness. The Upper West Side was rocky terrain, scattered shanties, grazing livestock. No gas lines, no water mains, no paved streets worth the name. The elevated railway had reached the area that same year, but passengers stared out at desolation. Squatters built shacks from scrap lumber. Goats wandered among boulders jutting from earth. At night, the district went dark. No one with money lived there. The wealthy occupied brownstones in Murray Hill and Gramercy Park. They built mansions along Fifth Avenue south of Central Park. The Upper East Side was beginning to attract development, but the western side of the park remained untouched. Real estate values reflected that reality. Land sold for fractions of downtown prices because buyers saw no future there. Edward Clark saw something different. He was 70 years old in 1879 and had built one of America's great fortunes. The Singer Sewing Machine Company had made him wealthy beyond measure. His partner, Isaac Singer, had died in 1875, leaving Clark as the company's dominant force. Singer sewing machines sold worldwide. The profits were immense. Clark had already proven himself in New York real estate. He had financed several successful residential buildings in established neighborhoods. He understood apartment living, a concept still relatively new to wealthy Americans. Europeans had lived in flats for generations. New Yorkers were slower to accept the idea. Single-family townhouses represented the proper way for respectable families to live. Apartments carried stigma, associated with boarding houses and the working class. But Clark believed the model could work for the wealthy if executed properly. Large apartments with high ceilings and modern amenities, buildings with elevators so residents didn't climb stairs, fireproof construction for safety, private spaces that functioned like horizontal townhouses stacked vertically. He had backed several such buildings downtown. They had succeeded. Now he looked north. Central Park had opened in stages beginning in 1858, completed fully by 1873. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux had transformed 840 acres of rocky swampland into landscaped paradise. The park was magnificent. Its western border ran along what would become Central Park West, though that name didn't exist yet. The avenue was called 8th Avenue above 59th Street, a dirt road that barely qualified as a street. Clark purchased property on the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue. The plot measured 200 feet along 8th Avenue and 175 feet along 72nd Street. The price was remarkably low by Manhattan standards. Sellers were happy to find any buyer for Upper West Side land. The neighborhood's reputation made marketing difficult. Respectable families wouldn't consider it. Investors saw no return potential. Clark hired architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg. He was 33 years old and had recently completed Vanderbilt family houses on Fifth Avenue. His training emphasized solid construction and historical European styles. He understood how to create buildings that projected permanence. Clark gave him a challenging brief. Design a luxury apartment building for a location where no luxury residents lived. Make it substantial enough to feel safe in a rough neighborhood. Include amenities that would justify moving to undeveloped land. create something that would anchor future development rather than simply participate in it. Hardenberg chose German Renaissance Revival style. The aesthetic drew from 16th century German architecture, gabled roofs, ornate terracotta details, heavy masonry. The style projected fortress-like strength while maintaining decorative elegance. For an isolated building in a questionable neighborhood, the fortress aspect mattered. Residents needed to feel protected. The design featured a hollow square plan with a central courtyard. The building would wrap around an open space accessible only through a guarded entrance archway, 4 wings forming a protective perimeter. The courtyard would provide light and air to interior rooms while creating a private world separate from surrounding streets. An iron gate would control access. No one entered without passing security. The scale was unprecedented for residential construction, 9 stories tall at a time when most New York buildings topped out at 5 or 6. The footprint would cover nearly the entire plot. The building would contain 65 apartments ranging from 4 rooms to over 20 rooms. The largest units would span entire floors. Every apartment would have high ceilings, thick walls, modern systems. Clark filed construction permits in 1880. The estimated cost was $2 million, an astronomical sum. For comparison, most substantial Manhattan townhouses cost $50,000 to $100,000 to build. Clark was spending more on a single apartment building than most developers spent on entire blocks. The investment only made sense if the neighborhood transformed. If the Upper West Side remained wilderness, the building would fail spectacularly. Newspapers noticed. The project was too large to ignore. Coverage was skeptical at best, openly mocking at worst. One frequently repeated story claimed a journalist told Clark he might as well build in Dakota territory. The Dakotas were the American frontier, recently open to settlement, symbolically remote from New York civilization. The name stuck. Clark reportedly embraced it. If critics wanted to call it the Dakota, he would make that the official name. Construction began in October 1880. Workers excavated the rocky site. Bedrock lay close to the surface across much of Manhattan. That provided solid foundation but made excavation difficult. Blasting was required to level the site and dig basement spaces. The work was loud, disruptive, slow. Nearby residents complained. There weren't many nearby residents. Materials arrived by wagon and rail, brick. Came from kilns in New Jersey. Terracotta ornaments were custom fabricated. Iron beams for fireproof floor construction came from foundries in Pennsylvania. Lumber for interior framing arrived from upstate mills. The logistics were complex. 8th Avenue was unpaved. Heavy loads carved ruts in dirt roads. Rain turned the site into mud. The workforce fluctuated between 200 and 400 men depending on construction phase. Skilled masons laid decorative brickwork. Iron workers installed fireproof floor systems. Carpenters framed interior walls. Laborers hauled materials and cleared debris. The work continued through winter cold and summer heat. Construction sites in the 1880s were dangerous. Falls, crushing injuries. Equipment accidents killed and maimed workers regularly. No systematic safety regulations existed. The design included innovations that set the Dakota apart. The building would be fireproof, critical, after the frequent fires that devastated wooden structures. Floor systems used iron beams and terracotta arch construction. Brick walls were thick, sometimes over 2 feet. Stairwells were enclosed in masonry. If fire started in one apartment, it wouldn't spread easily. Wealthy families remembered disasters that had consumed hotels and tenements. Fireproof construction was worth paying for. Elevators were essential. 9 stories meant no one would walk to upper floors regularly. The building would have 4 hydraulic elevators, 1 in each wing. Hydraulic systems used water pressure to lift the cab. They were slower than later electric elevators, but reliable. The machinery occupied basement space. Water tanks on the roof provided pressure. The building was wired for electricity, though electric service didn't exist in the neighborhood yet. Gas lines provided lighting and cooking fuel initially. But Clark anticipated that electricity would arrive eventually. When it did, the Dakota would be ready. Conduits and junction boxes were installed during construction. Each apartment would have its own bathroom, a luxury in 1880. Many Manhattan homes still used chamber pots and outhouses. The Dakota's plumbing system required extensive pipe networks. Water came from the city system when available, supplemented by roof cisterns during dry periods. Waste went to sewers where they existed, cesspools where they didn't. The Upper West Side's infrastructure was primitive. The central courtyard took shape as walls rose. The space measured roughly 100 feet square. It would be paved and planted with trees. Residents could access it from their apartment wings. The courtyard provided light and air, but also served as private outdoor space. No public access meant no street noise. Children could play under supervision. Adults could sit in relative quiet. Clark visited the construction site regularly during 1881 and early 1882. He was old by Victorian standards, over 70, but remained energetic. He reviewed progress with Hardenberg and construction supervisors. He made decisions about materials and details. The building was his vision, his financial risk. On April 14, 1882, Edward Clark died at his Manhattan home. He was 73. Heart failure was listed as the cause. He had lived long enough to see the Dakota's walls rise and the roof take shape, not long enough to witness completion. His family inherited the project along with his fortune. His son, Alfred Corning Clark, and grandson Edward Severin Clark became responsible for finishing what Edward had started. They could have halted construction. The building was already controversial. Continuing would require millions more. The family chose to proceed. By October 1884, the Dakota was finished. 4 years of construction had transformed Clark's controversial vision into physical reality. 9 stories of brick and terracotta stood at 72nd and 8th Avenue. Ornate gables crowned the roof line. Terracotta panels depicted faces, flowers, geometric patterns. Iron balconies jutted from upper floors. The building looked like something transported from Germany. A Renaissance palace reimagined as a Manhattan apartment house. The entrance archway on 72nd Street measured wide enough for carriages to pass through into the central courtyard. Iron gates controlled access. A porter's station stood just inside where staff could monitor everyone who entered. The archway tunnel extended roughly 40 feet through the building's base before opening into the courtyard. The passage created a threshold between the street and the private world within. The courtyard itself was paved and planted. Trees in large planters would eventually provide shade. Gas lamps illuminated the space at night. Each of the 4 wings had entrances accessible from the courtyard. Residents could reach their apartments without using street-facing doors. The design created separation from the surrounding neighborhood. You passed through the gate, crossed the courtyard, entered your building wing. The outside world stayed outside. Henry Hardenberg had designed the building with varying apartment sizes to attract different types of wealthy residents. The smallest units contained 4 rooms. The largest sprawled across 20 rooms, occupying entire floors. Most apartments fell somewhere in the middle, 8 to 12 rooms with high ceilings ranging from 10 to 14 feet. Every unit had multiple bedrooms, a formal dining room, parlors for entertaining, servants' quarters. The interiors featured oak woodwork, parquet floors, decorative plaster ceilings. Fireplaces provided supplemental heat in main rooms. Each apartment had its own bathroom, a genuine luxury. The plumbing fixtures were modern by 1884 standards. Porcelain toilets, enameled bathtubs, marble sinks. Hot water came from coal-fired boilers in the basement. The hydraulic elevators operated reliably, though slowly by later standards. Each wing had its own elevator shaft and machinery. Residents on upper floors depended on them. Climbing 7 or 8 flights of stairs was unacceptable for families who could afford Dakota rents. The building included amenities unprecedented in apartment construction: A private dining room operated on the ground floor where residents could host parties without using their own apartments. A laundry facility in the basement handled washing for families who didn't maintain their own laundry staff. Refrigerated storage rooms provided space for food preservation before electric refrigerators existed. Each apartment had its own storage cage in the basement for trunks and seasonal items. The roof featured unexpected luxuries. A croquet lawn occupied part of the space. Residents could play in summer without leaving the building. A tennis court was proposed, but never built. The roof also housed water cisterns, elevator machinery rooms, and coal-fired generators that would eventually provide electricity. The Dakota opened for occupancy in October 1884. The question everyone asked was simple: would anyone actually move in? The building stood alone in undeveloped neighborhood. The nearest substantial shops were blocks away. Transportation was limited to the elevated railway, which was loud, dirty, unreliable. The streets remained unpaved. At night, the area was dark and potentially dangerous. Initial occupancy proved skeptics partially right. The building filled slowly. By the end of the first year, approximately 40% of apartments were occupied. That was enough to cover basic operating costs, but far from full capacity. Empty apartments meant lost revenue. The Clark family had invested over $2 million. The building needed consistent rental income to justify that expenditure. But 40% occupancy in year one was better than critics had predicted. Some had assumed the building would stand completely empty, that New Yorkers with money would refuse to live that far uptown regardless of amenities. The fact that dozens of families chose the Dakota suggested Clark's gamble wasn't entirely foolish. Who moved in? The resident composition revealed something unexpected. Wealthy families accustomed to Fifth Avenue society did appear on tenant rolls, but they were outnumbered by another category: artists, composers, painters, writers, performers found the Dakota appealing for specific reasons. The apartments were spacious by downtown standards. High ceilings and thick walls provided acoustic separation. A composer could work at a piano without disturbing neighbors. A painter could use natural light from large windows. The location's isolation became an advantage. Fewer social obligations, fewer distractions. Rental prices reflected the experimental nature of the address. A 4-room apartment rented for roughly $1,500 annually. A 12-room unit cost $3,000 to $4,000 per year. Those figures were below comparable space in established neighborhoods. The discount compensated for location disadvantages. Families willing to accept Upper West Side living got more space for their money. Several prominent New Yorkers took apartments despite the neighborhood's reputation. Theophilus Brower Woolsey, a wealthy attorney, moved his family in. Edward Seligman Clark, one of Edward Clark's grandsons, maintained an apartment. Several German immigrant families found the building's architectural style comfortingly familiar. European immigrants, particularly Germans, were more accustomed to apartment living than native-born Americans. The building required substantial staff to operate. Each apartment employed its own servants who lived in quarters on the upper floors. But the building itself needed employees, doormen, controlled access at the street and courtyard gates. Engineers maintained boiler systems and elevators. Porters cleaned common areas. Groundskeepers tended the courtyard plantings. During winter, workers shoveled snow from the courtyard and entrance. The Dakota's success or failure would determine whether the Upper West Side developed further. If the building remained half-empty, other developers would avoid the area. No one would risk capital building luxury housing where the market had been proven weak. But if the Dakota filled completely and commanded strong rents, that would signal opportunity. The building was a test case. By 1886, occupancy had climbed above 60%. The trend was positive. Word spread among New York's artistic community about the building's advantages: large apartments, relatively affordable rents, thick walls for privacy, creative atmosphere. More musicians moved in, more painters. The Dakota was developing a reputation distinct from typical society residences. It wasn't just a place to live. It was becoming a place where artists worked. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. By 1890, the Dakota was approaching full occupancy. The building that critics had mocked 6 years earlier was now proving itself financially viable. More importantly, it was beginning to reshape the neighborhood around it. Other developers noticed, if wealthy tenants would pay for Upper West Side apartments, there was money to be made. The elevated railway that had reached the area in 1879 provided essential access. The Ninth Avenue Elevated ran north from Lower Manhattan, with a station at 72nd Street just blocks from the Dakota. The ride was uncomfortable, loud, dirty. Coal-burning locomotives spewed smoke and cinders, but the eel made commuting possible. Businessmen could live uptown and reach their offices downtown in under an hour. That accessibility was crucial. Infrastructure improvements accelerated through the 1890s. The city paved more streets. Gas lines extended further north. Water mains reached the Upper West Side with consistent pressure. Sewer systems replaced cesspools. Electric lines began appearing as power companies expanded service. The wilderness that had existed in 1880 was rapidly becoming civilized urban landscape. The Dakota had arrived too early. Now the neighborhood was catching up. Other apartment buildings rose near the Dakota through the 1890s and early 1900s. The San Remo, the El Dorado, the Kenilworth. Developers mimicked elements of the Dakota's design while adding their own variations: large apartments, high ceilings, courtyard layouts, grand entrances. The Upper West Side was becoming an apartment district distinct from the townhouse neighborhoods on the Upper East Side. The architectural character reflected that difference. Buildings were larger, more ornate, designed to announce their presence. Central Park's western edge transformed from wilderness boundary to prestigious address. Families who might have chosen Fifth Avenue instead looked west. The park views were equally spectacular. The apartments were often more spacious. Rents remained somewhat lower than comparable Upper East Side properties, though the gap was narrowing. The Dakota had proven a market existed. The building's resident composition continued to favor creative professionals. Composers found the Dakota particularly appealing. The combination of space, soundproofing, and artistic community created an environment conducive to musical work. Several prominent musicians maintained apartments through the 1890s and into the new century. The building earned a reputation as a place where serious artists lived and worked. That reputation attracted more artists, reinforcing the pattern. The physical structure required constant maintenance. The Clark family, which retained ownership after Edward's death, invested in upkeep and improvements. The original gas lighting was supplemented and eventually replaced by electric lights as power became reliably available. The hydraulic elevators were overhauled periodically to maintain safe operation. The courtyard landscaping matured as trees grew and plantings filled in. The building aged but didn't deteriorate. The entrance archway became iconic. The passage through the building's base with its iron gates and porter's station created a dramatic threshold. Arriving at the Dakota meant passing through that gateway into a protected world. The architectural theater of the entrance sequence was intentional. Hardenberg understood that how you entered a building shaped how you experienced it. The Dakota's entrance announced that crossing this threshold meant leaving ordinary city streets behind. The dry moat that surrounded three sides of the building served both practical and symbolic purposes. The sunken area provided light and air to basement windows, but it also created physical separation from the street. The Dakota sat slightly apart, elevated on its plot, bounded by the moat and the iron fence above it. The fortress appearance that had seemed paranoid in 1884 now looked prudent. Staff remained essential to operations. By the 1890s, the Dakota employed dozens of people in various roles: doormen, elevator operators, porters, maintenance workers, groundskeepers. Each apartment also employed its own servants. A typical 12-room apartment might have a cook, a maid, a butler living in the servants' quarters on the upper floor. Wealthy families expected that level of domestic help. The Dakota's design accommodated it with separate servant staircases, back hallways, dedicated servants' quarters separate from family spaces. The building's success validated several of Edward Clark's assumptions. Wealthy New Yorkers would accept apartment living if the apartments were large enough and well appointed enough to feel like private homes. Location mattered less than initially thought if the building itself offered sufficient amenities and quality. The Upper West Side's isolation had been temporary. Infrastructure and development eventually arrived just as Clark predicted. His death in 1882 meant he never witnessed the vindication. The neighborhood's reputation improved dramatically between 1890 and 1900. What had been frontier became fashionable. Society families who would have rejected the Upper West Side in 1880 now considered it acceptable. The transformation happened quickly once it started. Development accelerated. More apartment buildings rose. Retail shops opened to serve the growing population. Restaurants appeared. The basic infrastructure of urban life established itself. The Dakota's architectural distinction became more apparent as surrounding buildings filled in. Hardenberg's German Renaissance design was unique on the Upper West Side. Other buildings used different styles: Beaux-Arts, Renaissance Revival, various eclectic combinations. But nothing looked quite like the Dakota. The gabled roof line, the ornate terracotta details, the fortress-like mass made it instantly recognizable. As the neighborhood became denser, the Dakota remained visually dominant. Henry Hardenberg went on to design other major New York buildings, most notably the Plaza Hotel, which opened in 1907. His reputation was secure. The Dakota had been an early commission, a challenging project in an uncertain location. Its success helped establish him as a premier architect. The building demonstrated his ability to create structures that were both functional and architecturally distinguished. By 1900, the Dakota was no longer an experiment. It was an established, successful residential building in a thriving neighborhood. The initial skepticism had been forgotten. Clark's folly had become Clark's vindication. The building proved that bold real estate vision could reshape entire districts. The Upper West Side's development began with the Dakota. Everything that followed traced back to Edward Clark's willingness to build where others wouldn't. The gamble had paid off. The early 20th century brought changes to the Dakota beyond simple occupancy increases. The building's character evolved as New York itself transformed. The artistic community that had formed in the 1890s deepened and expanded. More composers, more painters, more writers chose the building specifically because other artists lived there. The Dakota was becoming a creative hub where musicians met collaborators and painters found buyers. The social network inside the building had value beyond the physical apartments. Theodore Steinway moved into the Dakota in the early 1900s. His family's piano manufacturing company was world-renowned. Having Steinway as a resident reinforced the building's musical reputation. Musicians knew they lived in the same building as the man whose pianos they played. The connection mattered symbolically, even if Steinway himself wasn't personally involved in their careers. The building's thick walls and solid construction served composers particularly well. A violinist could practice for hours without disturbing neighbors in adjacent apartments. A pianist could work late into the night. The acoustic isolation that Hardenberg's heavy masonry construction provided was essential for serious musical work. Thin walls would have made the building uninhabitable for musicians. Several prominent conductors maintained apartments at the Dakota through the early decades of the century. They valued proximity to Lincoln Center's precursor institutions and the general artistic atmosphere of the Upper West Side. The neighborhood around the building was developing cultural infrastructure: concert halls, rehearsal spaces, music schools. The Dakota sat at the center of Manhattan's emerging classical music district. The building's ownership passed through the Clark family's various heirs and trusts. The original Edward Clark had died in 1882. His son Alfred died in 1896. The grandson Edward Severin Clark managed the property until his death in 1933. Each generation maintained the building to high standards. The family understood they owned something valuable, not just financially, but culturally. The Dakota had become a New York institution. Letting it deteriorate would have been abandoning a legacy. Maintenance was expensive and constant. The roof required periodic repairs. The elevators needed regular overhauls. The plumbing systems developed leaks that had to be addressed. The courtyard landscaping required professional gardeners. The iron gates and decorative metalwork needed painting to prevent rust. The terracotta ornaments occasionally cracked and required replacement. Operating a building of the Dakota's size and complexity cost thousands of dollars monthly, even when every apartment was rented. The building's finances became more complicated as property taxes increased and operating costs rose. By the 1920s, the economic model that had worked in the 1880s was becoming strained. Rental income that once covered expenses comfortably now barely broke even. The Clark family trusts that controlled the building began exploring alternatives. Converting to cooperative ownership emerged as a possibility. If residents owned their apartments rather than renting, they would bear maintenance costs directly. The family could sell the building, recover capital, exit the real estate management business. Cooperative ownership was still relatively new in New York. A handful of apartment buildings had converted successfully. The model worked like this. Residents purchased shares in a corporation that owned the building. Each shareholder received the right to occupy a specific apartment. The corporation collected monthly maintenance fees to cover operating expenses. The arrangement gave residents ownership stakes while maintaining centralized building management. Converting existing rental buildings to cooperatives required convincing tenants to become buyers. The Dakota's conversion process began in the late 1920s but stalled during the Great Depression. Real estate markets collapsed. No one was buying apartments. Rental income fell as some residents struggled to pay. The building remained under rental management through the 1930s. The conversion would wait for better economic conditions. The Depression years tested the Dakota's financial stability. Vacancies increased as some families couldn't afford rent. The Clark Trusts reduced rents rather than lose tenants entirely. The goal was maintaining occupancy and covering basic operating expenses. Profit was secondary to preserving the building. The family's wealth cushioned the impact. Other landlords facing similar pressures let their buildings deteriorate or sold at losses. The Dakota remained well-maintained because the family had resources to absorb short-term losses. World War II brought different challenges. Many younger residents entered military service. Housing shortages in New York created demand but also strain on aging infrastructure. Materials for repairs became scarce due to wartime rationing. The building survived the war years without major damage but with accumulated maintenance needs. When peace returned, significant renovation work was required. The post-war years brought renewed discussion of cooperative conversion. The real estate market recovered. Property values rose. Residents who had lived through depression and war were financially stable again. Many were interested in ownership rather than continued renting. The cultural climate had shifted toward home ownership as a marker of success and security. Converting the Dakota to cooperative ownership aligned with broader social trends. The conversion happened in 1961. The Dakota Apartments Corporation was formed. Existing tenants were offered the opportunity to purchase shares corresponding to their apartments. Most accepted. Some longtime residents who couldn't afford purchase prices or didn't want ownership responsibility moved out. New residents purchased those vacated apartments. Within 2 years, the conversion was essentially complete. The Dakota was now a cooperative owned by its residents rather than by the Clark family heirs. The cooperative structure required formal governance. A board of directors elected by shareholders made decisions about building management, maintenance priorities, and most importantly, approval of new residents. When apartments became available through sale or inheritance that were indicated heredices, the board reviewed potential buyers. They evaluated financial capacity to pay purchase price and monthly maintenance. They also evaluated whether prospective residents would fit the building's character and culture. This approval process gave the board significant power over who could live in the Dakota. The board developed a reputation for strict standards. Applicants needed substantial financial resources. A general guideline emerged that buyers should have liquid assets equal to several times the apartment purchase price. The monthly maintenance fees were high, typically several $1,000s. Prospective residents needed income sufficient to cover those fees comfortably. The financial bar was set deliberately high. The board wanted residents who could support the building's ongoing expenses without strain. The approval process also considered intangible factors. Would the applicant respect the building's architectural character? Would they contribute positively to the community? Would they create disruptions or problems? The board exercised subjective judgment. That discretion occasionally generated controversy. Some rejected applicants claimed the board's decisions reflected prejudice or arbitrary personal preferences. The board maintained they were protecting the building's long-term interests and existing residents' quality of life. Several celebrity applicants were reportedly rejected over the years. Cher supposedly applied and was turned down. Billy Joel was rejected according to some accounts. The board's reasoning wasn't public, but speculation suggested they worried about security issues, media attention, lifestyle factors. Whether those specific rejections actually happened is disputed. But the stories reinforced the Dakota's reputation for exclusivity. Getting board approval wasn't automatic regardless of wealth or fame. The conversion to cooperative ownership in 1961 marked a transition point. The building's character began shifting subtly but noticeably. Rental tenancy had created fluidity. People moved in, lived for years, moved out when circumstances changed. Cooperative ownership encouraged permanence. Residents who purchased apartments intended to stay. They had made substantial financial investments. Selling and moving meant transaction costs and board approval hassles. The result was a more stable, less transient population. The 1960s brought the Dakota into a new era of cultural prominence. The building had always housed artists and musicians, but now it was attracting major celebrities from entertainment and the arts. The combination of architectural distinction, Upper West Side location, spacious apartments, and cooperative exclusivity appealed to people who valued privacy and prestige. The board's strict approval process paradoxically made the building more desirable. Rejection stories enhanced the mystique. Getting approved meant you had passed a test that others failed. Lauren Bacall purchased an apartment in the mid-1960s. The legendary actress and widow of Humphrey Bogart wanted a New York base after years in California. She chose the Dakota for its architecture and privacy. The thick walls meant paparazzi couldn't hear conversations. The guarded entrance kept unwanted visitors out. The building provided security without visible fortress-like measures. Bacall became one of the Dakota's most prominent residents, maintaining her apartment for decades. Leonard Bernstein moved into the Dakota in the late 1960s. The composer and conductor was at the height of his fame as music director of the New York Philharmonic. He purchased a large apartment that could accommodate a piano and space for composition. Bernstein's presence reinforced the building's musical heritage. The Dakota had housed musicians since the 1880s. Now it was home to one of the most famous conductors in the world. The tradition continued. Roberta Flack, the Grammy-winning singer and pianist, took an apartment in the Dakota in the early 1970s. She valued the building's acoustic properties and artistic community. Living among other musicians and artists created an environment where creative work was understood and respected. Neighbors didn't complain about piano practice or late-night recording sessions. The building's culture supported rather than hindered artistic production. Rudolf Nureyev, the Soviet ballet dancer who had defected to the West, maintained an apartment at the Dakota. The building's international architectural character appealed to him. The German Renaissance design felt European in ways that typical American apartment buildings did not. Nureyev valued that old-world quality. He also appreciated the privacy and security the building provided. As a high-profile defector, he faced genuine safety concerns. The Dakota's controlled access offered protection. The building's growing celebrity concentration created practical challenges. Media attention increased. Photographers sometimes waited outside the entrance hoping to catch residents. Delivery services had to navigate stricter security protocols. The board responded by tightening access controls. The doormen received instructions to scrutinize everyone who approached. No one passed through the archway without legitimate business inside. In 1968, Roman Polanski filmed Rosemary's Baby using the Dakota's exterior. The psychological horror film starred Mia Farrow as a young woman living in an old Manhattan apartment building who becomes convinced her neighbors are members of a satanic cult. Polanski couldn't film inside the actual Dakota, but the exterior shots established the building as the story's location. The film was both a critical and commercial success. It introduced the Dakota to millions of moviegoers who had never heard of it. The movie created an association between the Dakota and Gothic horror that persisted for decades. The building's fortress-like appearance, the dark archway entrance, the ornate Victorian details all contributed to an ominous atmosphere on screen. Polanski used the architecture to create unease. The Dakota looked like the kind of place where terrible things might happen behind closed doors. That wasn't the image residents necessarily wanted, but it made the building instantly recognizable globally. The film also generated urban legends. Stories circulated about the building being haunted, about secret passages in the walls, about mysterious deaths. Most were fiction inspired by the movie rather than actual building history. But the legends became part of the Dakota's mythology. Tourists began appearing, taking photographs of the entrance, hoping to glimpse celebrities. The board and residents tolerated this attention, but didn't encourage it. The building received landmark designation from the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1969. The designation recognized the Dakota's architectural and historical significance. It also imposed restrictions on exterior modifications. The cooperative board couldn't alter the facade, change the roofline, or modify architectural details without commission approval. The designation protected the building from inappropriate changes but also limited the board's autonomy. Preservation and property rights occasionally conflicted. Landmark status increased the building's cultural importance. The Dakota wasn't just a prestigious address, it was now officially a historic structure worthy of protection. That status attracted residents who valued living in a building with documented significance. It also attracted attention from architecture historians, preservationists, urban planners. The Dakota became a case study in how luxury apartment buildings could be preserved and adapted for modern use while maintaining original character. The Upper West Side continued developing through the 1960s and 70s. Lincoln Center opened in the mid-1960s, bringing major cultural institutions to the neighborhood. The Metropolitan Opera, the New York Philharmonic, the New York City Ballet all relocated to the new complex. The Dakota sat just blocks from Lincoln Center. The proximity was convenient for musicians and performers. The cultural infrastructure that Edward Clark had anticipated in 1880 was finally fully realized, nearly a century later. The building's maintenance costs continued rising. The cooperative structure meant shareholders bore those expenses through monthly maintenance fees. By the early 1970s, monthly fees for large apartments reached several $1,000s. Those fees covered staff salaries, utilities, repairs, insurance, property taxes, capital improvements. The board carefully managed finances but couldn't prevent cost increases driven by inflation and New York's rising labor costs. The strictness of the board's approval process became more pronounced. Financial requirements increased as building expenses rose. The board wanted residents who could comfortably afford maintenance fees without strain. They also wanted people who would maintain their apartments to high standards. Neglected interiors would eventually require expensive repairs that became the building's responsibility. The board increasingly viewed apartment sales as opportunities to select residents who would be assets rather than liabilities. Some critics argued the approval process had become too restrictive, that the board was creating an environment of excessive exclusivity. Supporters countered that cooperative boards had both the legal right and the practical necessity to carefully evaluate prospective residents. The building's long-term financial health depended on residents who paid maintenance promptly and maintained their units properly. The board's strictness, they argued, protected everyone's investment. The Dakota's reputation evolved through the 1960s and early 70s from distinguished older building to cultural icon. The combination of architectural landmark status, celebrity residence, Rosemary's Baby fame, and board exclusivity created a mystique that extended far beyond New York real estate circles. The building had become famous not just for what it was, but for what it represented. Old New York wealth, artistic achievement, architectural preservation, social exclusivity, all embodied in 9 stories of brick and terracotta. The Dakota was no longer just an apartment building. It was a symbol. In the spring of 1973, Yoko Ono walked through the Dakota's entrance archway looking for an apartment. She'd grown tired of living in hotels and temporary accommodations. She wanted a permanent New York residence. The Dakota appealed for several reasons. The building's artistic reputation aligned with her background as an avant-garde artist. The security and privacy mattered enormously, and the architecture itself, the fortress-like presence, the protected courtyard, suggested safety. She found what she wanted. Apartment 72 was a 7-room unit on the 7th floor. The space wasn't the largest in the building, but it was substantial. High ceilings, thick walls, windows facing the courtyard. The apartment needed renovation, but had good bones. Yoko made an offer. The board reviewed her application. She had the financial resources required. Her artistic credentials were impeccable. The board approved her purchase. Yoko's husband, John Lennon, was initially less enthusiastic about the Dakota. He found the building dark and gloomy. The Gothic architecture reminded him of horror films. But Yoko insisted. She believed the building's protective qualities were essential. The couple had faced harassment, threats, constant media intrusion. The Dakota offered a level of security that few New York buildings could match. Lennon eventually agreed. They purchased the apartment for approximately $150,000. By contemporary standards, that was expensive but not outrageous for Manhattan real estate. The couple moved in during the summer of 1973. Renovations continued while they lived there. They hired architects and contractors to reconfigure spaces, update systems, create the home they envisioned. Lennon began spending more time at the Dakota and less time resenting the move. The building's qualities became apparent. The soundproofing was excellent. The doormen were professional and protective. Neighbors respected privacy. No one bothered them in the courtyard or hallways. Lennon and Ono acquired additional apartments as they became available. Eventually, they owned 5 separate units in the building. They used one as a bedroom apartment, another as Lennon's studio space, a third for guests, a fourth for business offices, the 5th for storage. The expansion reflected both their financial success and their commitment to the Dakota as their permanent home. They weren't just living there. They were putting down roots. The building became Lennon's retreat from public life. After the intense years of Beatlemania, the activism of the late 1960s, the immigration battles with the U.S. government through the early 1970s, Lennon craved ordinary domestic life. The Dakota provided that. He could walk to Central Park with his son Sean. He could buy bread at local shops. He could exist as John Lennon the person, rather than John Lennon, the cultural icon. The neighborhood allowed relative anonymity. Upper West Side residents were accustomed to celebrities. They didn't make a fuss. Lennon took a 5-year break from music starting in 1975 to focus on raising Sean, who was born that October. He became a house husband his term. He baked bread, cooked meals, managed the household while Yoko handled business affairs. The Dakota's spacious layout accommodated that domestic life. The kitchen was large enough for serious cooking. Sean had room to play. The building's security meant Lennon could focus on family without constant concern about intrusion. The years from 1975 to 1980 were the most settled of Lennon's adult life. He wasn't touring, wasn't recording, wasn't engaged in public controversies. He was simply living at the Dakota with his family. Neighbors occasionally encountered him in the courtyard or elevator. He was friendly, but guarded. He appreciated that Dakota residents understood the unwritten rule. You didn't bother famous neighbors. You didn't ask for autographs. You treated them as fellow residents rather than celebrities. Lennon resumed recording in 1980. He and Yoko produced the album Double Fantasy, released in November. The album represented Lennon's return to public music making after his domestic hiatus. Reviews were mixed initially, but the album sold well. Lennon gave interviews discussing his years as a house husband, his devotion to Sean, his contentment with domestic life at the Dakota. The building featured prominently in his descriptions of this period. He called it home without reservation. The building's entrance became part of Lennon's daily routine. The archway on 72nd Street, the tunnel through the building's base, the courtyard beyond. He passed through that sequence multiple times daily, walking to Central Park, going to the recording studio, running errands in the neighborhood. The entrance was a transitional space between public street and private home. The Dakota's design created that threshold deliberately. Residents crossed from public to private with clear demarcation. On the evening of December 8, 1980, Lennon and Ono left the Dakota for a recording session. A man approached them outside the entrance. Mark David Chapman had been waiting there since morning. Lennon had signed an autograph for him earlier that day. Chapman asked no questions this time. Lennon and Ono got into their limousine and departed. They returned to the Dakota around 10:50 p.m. The car pulled up to the entrance on 72nd Street. Lennon and Ono stepped out carrying tape cassettes from the studio session. They walked toward the archway entrance. Chapman was still there. He called out Lennon's name. When Lennon turned, Chapman fired 5 shots from a revolver. 4 bullets struck Lennon in the back and shoulder. He stumbled forward through the archway, into the Dakota's entrance passage. He collapsed at the doorman's station. Police arrived within minutes. They transported Lennon to Roosevelt Hospital rather than waiting for an ambulance. He died in the emergency room at 11:15 p.m. The immediate cause was massive blood loss from the gunshot wounds. Chapman remained at the scene, reading a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He was arrested without incident. News spread through the building immediately. Residents heard the shots or learned from doormen what had happened. Within hours, crowds began gathering on 72nd Street outside the entrance. Fans brought flowers, candles, photographs. They sang Beatles songs. They wept. The makeshift memorial grew throughout the night. By morning, thousands of people filled the sidewalk and street. The Dakota's entrance became the focal point of global mourning. Television cameras captured the archway where Lennon died. Newspapers printed photographs of the gate and the crowd beyond. The building's Gothic architecture framed images of grief. The fortress that had protected Lennon for 7 years had failed at the moment when protection mattered most. He died on his doorstep, yards from safety. Yoko remained inside the Dakota. The building's security kept reporters and crowds away from her apartment. She released a brief statement asking for privacy. The Dakota board and staff worked to maintain normal operations while residents grieved. The building that had always valued privacy was now the center of global media attention. That attention wouldn't fade quickly. The murder transformed the Dakota's public image permanently. The building had been famous before. Now it was infamous. The entrance where Lennon died became a pilgrimage site. Fans visited from around the world to stand where he fell. The city eventually created strawberry fields, a memorial section of Central Park directly across from the Dakota. The memorial redirected some foot traffic, but didn't eliminate the building's role as a shrine. Security protocols changed immediately after the murder. The board tightened access controls. Additional doormen were hired. Surveillance cameras were installed. The gate security became more aggressive about screening visitors. Residents accepted these measures despite the inconvenience. The murder proved that celebrity residents faced genuine threats. The building had to respond accordingly. The Dakota had always been protective. Now it became a fortress in practice as well as appearance. Yoko Ono never left the Dakota. She maintained her apartments there through the decades following Lennon's murder. The building became her permanent home, the place where she and Lennon had lived together, where Sean grew up, where their family life had unfolded. Other residents might have found living at the murder site unbearable. Yoko stayed. The Dakota was home despite the tragedy associated with it. Her presence influenced the building's character. She was the Dakota's most famous resident, its connection to Beatles history, and a reminder of what happened outside the entrance in 1980. New residents understood that living at the Dakota meant living with that history. The building's identity was inseparable from Lennon's death. Tourists photographed the entrance. Fans left flowers on anniversaries. The building couldn't escape its role as murder site and memorial. The board navigated this attention carefully. They wanted to honor Lennon's memory without letting the building become only about him. The Dakota was a functioning residential building with dozens of families living ordinary lives. It couldn't become a museum. The board discouraged tour groups and unauthorized commemorations. They instructed doormen to keep crowds moving along the sidewalk. The building had to remain a home first and a historic site second. Over time, Yoko acquired additional apartments beyond the 5 she and Lennon had owned together. By the 2000s, she reportedly controlled more than 20 units in the building. Some were combined into expanded living spaces. Others were maintained as separate apartments for staff, storage, investment. Her real estate holdings made her one of the building's largest stakeholders. That gave her significant influence over board decisions and building policy. The cooperative board's approval process became even stricter after Lennon's murder. Security concerns intensified. The board wanted residents who wouldn't attract dangerous attention or create security problems. They also wanted people who understood the building's unique character and challenges. Living at the Dakota meant accepting constant tourist presence outside, media interest in the building, the weight of its tragic history. Not everyone could handle that psychologically. The financial requirements for purchase remained extraordinarily high. By the 1990s, Dakota apartments were selling for several $1 million each. The largest units commanded prices exceeding $10 million. Monthly maintenance fees ranged from $5,000 to over $15,000 depending on apartment size. The board required proof that buyers could afford not just purchase price, but ongoing costs. They wanted to see liquid assets equal to multiple times the purchase price. The bar was set deliberately out of reach for all but the wealthiest New Yorkers. Several high-profile rejection stories emerged over the years. Gene Simmons of Kiss reportedly applied and was rejected. Melanie Griffith and Antonio Banderas were turned down according to some accounts. Carly Simon was rejected despite being a successful musician with the financial resources required. The board's reasoning remained confidential, but speculation suggested they worried about lifestyle issues, publicity, simple personal judgment that applicants wouldn't fit the building's culture. The rejection stories served a purpose beyond simple exclusivity. They reinforced the Dakota's mystique. Getting board approval meant you had achieved something rare and difficult. The rejection of famous, wealthy celebrities emphasized that money and fame weren't sufficient. You needed something else. What that something was remained deliberately vague. Discretion, perhaps, respect for tradition, an understanding of the building's special character. The board maintained control over defining those intangible qualities. Other celebrities did gain approval and moved in. Maury Povich and Connie Chung purchased an apartment, Jason Robards lived there, Rex Reed maintained a unit. The building continued attracting entertainment industry figures, though fewer than might be expected given its fame. The board's selectivity kept celebrity concentration moderate. They didn't want the Dakota to become known primarily as a celebrity building. That would compromise the privacy that made it desirable in the first place. Architectural preservation remained a priority. The building's landmark status meant exterior modifications required approval from the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission. But interior preservation was equally important. The board encouraged residents to maintain original architectural details: high ceilings, parquet floors, decorative plasterwork, oak woodwork. When apartments changed hands, the board reviewed renovation plans. They rejected proposals that would destroy historic elements. The building's character depended on those original details surviving. Maintenance costs continued escalating. Labor costs, energy costs, insurance, property taxes all increased relentlessly. The building's age meant systems required constant attention. The elevators, installed in the 1880s and updated periodically, needed ongoing maintenance. The plumbing systems developed leaks. The roof required repairs. The terracotta ornaments weathered and occasionally needed replacement. The courtyard landscaping required professional care. Operating a 140-year-old building was expensive under any circumstances. Operating it to luxury standards was even more costly. The board assessed shareholders periodically for major capital improvements. Replacing all windows in the building cost millions. Updating the electrical systems required extensive work. Renovating the basement storage areas and service spaces involved significant expense. Each assessment added thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to what residents already paid in monthly maintenance. Shareholders grumbled, but paid. They understood the building required investment to maintain value and livability. Ghost stories persisted. Several residents reported seeing Lenin's ghost in hallways or the courtyard. Others claimed to hear his voice or sense his presence. The stories were probably folklore rather than genuine supernatural encounters, but they became part of Dakota mythology. The building had appeared in Rosemary's Baby as a setting for occult horror. Lenin's murder added real tragedy. Ghost stories seemed almost inevitable given that history. The entrance archway remained the building's most photographed feature. Tourists stood on 72nd Street taking pictures of the spot where Lenin died. The Dakota couldn't control public sidewalks. The city had created strawberry fields across the street in Central Park as an official memorial. But that didn't stop people from focusing on the building itself. The archway appeared in countless photographs, documentaries, news reports. It was visually distinctive and historically significant. Media coverage of anything related to Lenin almost always included shots of the Dakota entrance. By the 21st century, the Dakota had stood for over 120 years. It had survived every threat that typically destroys historic buildings: economic downturns that bankrupted landlords and led to demolition, development pressure that turned other sites into modern high-rises, changing tastes that made Victorian architecture seem outdated. The building endured because of careful stewardship, landmark protection, cooperative ownership structure, simple good fortune. It helped that the apartments remained desirable. People wanted to live there. That sustained demand justified the expense of preservation. The building's role in New York's cultural landscape was secure. It appeared in films, novels, television shows. Architecture students studied it. Preservation advocates cited it as a successful example of adaptive reuse. The Dakota proved that 19th century luxury apartment buildings could remain relevant and valuable in modern Manhattan. The original design had been so thoughtful, so well executed, that the building adapted to changing needs without losing essential character. The Dakota in the 2010s and 2020s remained essentially what it had been since 1884, a luxury apartment building occupied by wealthy residents who valued privacy, architecture, history. The fundamental character hadn't changed despite 130-plus years of evolution. The building still offered large apartments with high ceilings and thick walls. It still housed artists and musicians alongside business executives and old money families. It still maintained strict cooperative board approval. The Dakota's continuity across more than a century was its most remarkable feature. Real estate values reflected the building's iconic status. Apartments rarely came on the market. When they did, prices started in the tens of millions. A medium-sized apartment sold for $15 million in 2015. A larger unit commanded $25 million in 2018. The most expensive Dakota apartment ever sold went for over $40 million in the early 2020s. Those prices reflected not just Manhattan real estate values, but the premium attached to living in the Dakota specifically. Buyers paid for the address, the history, the architecture, the exclusivity. The board continued rejecting more applicants than it approved. Financial qualification remained the baseline requirement. Proof of assets sufficient to cover purchase price, plus several years of maintenance fees. Liquid assets, not just net worth. The board wanted people who could write checks without selling property or liquidating investments. That requirement alone eliminated most potential buyers. Even successful professionals earning $500,000 annually often couldn't meet the liquidity standards. Beyond finances, the board evaluated character and lifestyle. Would the applicant maintain the apartment properly? Would they respect the building's rules and culture? Would they create security problems or media attention? The board conducted extensive background checks. They interviewed references. They reviewed financial records in detail. The process could take months. Some applicants withdrew before receiving decisions, finding the scrutiny excessive. Current residents included a mix of entertainment figures, finance executives, real estate developers, and families who had owned apartments for generations. Several residents had inherited their units from parents or grandparents who purchased during the early cooperative conversion years. Those multi-generational families provided continuity. They remembered the building before Lenin, before landmark designation, when it was simply a well-maintained older apartment building. Their institutional memory helped preserve the Dakota's character as something beyond a celebrity residence or tourist attraction. The building's staff numbered around 50 employees: doormen, porters, maintenance workers, elevator operators, security personnel. Some had worked at the Dakota for decades. They understood the building's systems and residents' expectations. Staff turnover was low because the jobs paid well and offered union benefits. The Dakota's reputation as a quality employer helped retain experienced people. That continuity mattered. Long-serving staff knew the building intimately and could handle problems before they became serious. The entrance archway remained the focus of tourist attention. On any given day, dozens of people photographed the gate where Lenin died. December 8th brought crowds numbering in the hundreds. Fans gathered to commemorate the murder anniversary. They sang Beatles songs, lit candles, left flowers. The building tolerated these gatherings while keeping them off private property. The archway was the threshold between public sidewalk and private courtyard. The gate marked that boundary literally and symbolically. Strawberry fields in Central Park absorbed some tourist traffic. The memorial's mosaic Imagine Circle became an official place to pay respects to Lenin. but many visitors wanted to see the actual building where he lived and died. No memorial in the park could replace the Dakota's role as the authentic site. The building was where Lenin's life ended. That geographic specificity couldn't be transferred elsewhere. The physical structure required constant care. The brick facade needed periodic repointing to maintain structural integrity. The terracotta ornaments weathered and occasionally cracked, requiring expert restoration. The roof was replaced entirely in the 2000s at a cost of several $1 million. The original 1880s plumbing systems had been replaced decades earlier, but even those replacements were aging and needed attention. The building's bones were solid, but everything built on those bones required maintenance. The cooperative board faced ongoing decisions about modernization versus preservation. Residents wanted updated amenities, high-speed internet, modern climate control, security systems. But installing new systems in a 140-year-old building was complicated. Running conduit through thick masonry walls risked damaging historic fabric. The board had to balance resident comfort with preservation requirements. They generally erred toward preservation when conflicts arose. The building's historic character was more valuable than any modern convenience. Several apartments underwent major renovations in the 2010s. The board reviewed each project carefully. They approved updates that respected original layouts and details while incorporating modern systems. They rejected proposals that would gut interiors or destroy historic elements. The goal was allowing apartments to meet contemporary living standards without losing the features that made them special. High ceilings, parquet floors, decorative plasterwork, oak woodwork. These had to remain. The building's energy efficiency was poor by modern standards. The original construction predated insulation technology. Single-pane windows leaked heat. The thick masonry walls provided thermal mass but not insulation. Heating and cooling costs were enormous. The board explored improvements but faced limitations. Installing modern insulated windows would alter the building's appearance, requiring Landmark's commission approval. Adding exterior insulation was impossible. The Dakota would never meet contemporary energy efficiency standards. Residents accepted high utility costs as part of living there. Yoko Ono remained the building's most prominent resident into her late 80s. She maintained her extensive apartment holdings and continued managing Lenin's estate from the Dakota. Her longevity at the building, over 50 years by the 2020s, made her a living connection to the building's late 20th century history. Newer residents knew the Dakota partly through Yoko's continued presence. She was a reminder that the building wasn't just history, it was home to people with ongoing lives. The Dakota's role in popular culture continued. Films and television shows used its exterior to establish New York's setting and atmosphere. The building appeared in countless photographs, documentaries, books about New York architecture. It was featured in real estate articles as an example of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses. The combination of architectural distinction, celebrity associations, and tragic history made it endlessly fascinating to people who would never see inside. The question of what happens when buildings like the Dakota eventually require major structural work remained unanswered. At some point, possibly decades in the future, the building might need such extensive renovation that it becomes temporarily uninhabitable. The cooperative board was building reserves for that possibility, but the costs would be astronomical. Maintaining a 19th century building to 21st century luxury standards required resources most cooperatives couldn't marshal. The Dakota could do it because apartments were so valuable that shareholders had enormous financial incentives to preserve their investments. Edward Clark's gamble on the Upper West Side had outlasted every prediction. The building survived initial skepticism about location. It survived economic depressions and wars. It survived changing architectural tastes. It survived cooperative conversion. It survived becoming famous. It survived murder and tragedy. The Dakota endured because people kept choosing it, kept investing in it, kept believing it was worth preserving. The fortress on 72nd Street still stands. The archway entrance still creates a threshold between public street and private courtyard. The thick walls still provide acoustic isolation for musicians and privacy for everyone else. The high ceilings and parquet floors still evoke Gilded Age construction. The building still houses artists alongside wealthy families. Buildings don't last 140 years by accident. They last because each generation decides preservation matters more than demolition. The Dakota survived because enough people believed a palace built in wilderness deserved to remain standing. New York's most famous apartment building endures not despite its age, but because of it. The story isn't finished. The Dakota continues.